Okay, so that clip, I'm going to use that clip of MLK, which I will link the link to the full video in the comments, and in the description of the subsequent YouTube video that I make based on this. I'm going to use that MLK clip to talk about something that I have been thinking about for a while, and that is resistance and its relationship to violence. Now, over the past few weeks, due to recent events involving individuals such as Charlie Kirk, there's been a lot of a resurgence in discourse about the idea that the only viable way to resist an oppressive government is through peaceful protest, even if the oppressive government resorts to horrific violence. And oftentimes, this comes from individuals who live in a place of immense privilege, i.e., people like people who come from a background like myself, i.e., white Americans, oftentimes white American leftists. And in many ways, the reason for this is the, rightfully so, but still, the mythologization and idolization of MLK. And that in itself is not wrong. I do want to say that. That is very admirable in many ways. However, it ignores one of the lived experiences of marginalized groups, Native Americans, African Americans, etc., who, are saying, hey, maybe this is not necessarily going to be always possible. Eventually, violence may or may not be what we need to resort to. And I'm not going to speak on whether or not we should do that, but I do think it's important to listen to their experiences. And I also think it's important to point out that there are many examples throughout history of people who were peaceful, and peacefully protested or assimilated into American culture very peacefully, and then they still were massacred. We can see this in the Gnadenhutten massacre in 1782, where peaceful Moravian Native Americans who converted to Christianity and who were pacifists were massacred by members of the Continental Army and the militia related to the who would eventually become the United States. We can see this in the Sand Creek massacre, where hundreds of predominantly unarmed women and children of the Cheyenne and Arapaho Nation who were there seeking peace and as refugees were massacred by the United States Army. It's important to note they were also being led by Black Kettle, a pacifist Cheyenne chief who constantly sought peace even after this battle and sought attempts to form peace agreements with the United States. We can see this in the Battle of Washita, or the Washita Massacre, where again a similar thing happened to Black Kettle's Cheyenne band, his band of the Cheyenne Nation, where hundreds of predominantly unarmed women and children were massacred, despite Black Kettle being a pacifist and refusing to go to war with the United States. There's the Sacramento River Massacre, where between 125 to 900 unarmed, mainly women and children of the Wintu Nation were massacred by John C. Fremont and Kit Carson and the United States Army and militia. And the Battle of Big Hole, where the Nez Perce were descended upon while trying to flee the United States, where predominantly unarmed women and children were again massacred by the United States. They were being led by Chief Joseph, who was refusing to fight the United States and was attempting to flee. Then there's the Indian removal, the forcible removal of Native Americans from east of the Mississippi in the southeast and the northeast, that resulted in tens of thousands of Native Americans losing their lives due to starvation, disease, exposure to the weather, and then, yes, in some cases in war, particularly the Muskogee Creek and the Seminole and the Sac and Fox tribes. But generally, most of the Native Americans removed were peaceful and had assimilated into the United States' culture, at least partially, in an attempt to broker peace, lasting peace with the United States. And despite that, they were still forcibly removed, and thousands died. And that's essentially the crux of the point, is that we see all these examples of people who were peaceful, attempting to do things peacefully, and were still killed anyway. And again, as I have to go back to, a lot of people like to, rightfully so, like to idolize Martin Luther King and his pacifism and his peaceful protests and such. However, as you can see here in this excerpt of his speech that I will include in the comments and in the subsequent description of the YouTube video that I make out of this, you can see right here in that line where he even admits that while he does not agree with riots, and violence in response to oppression, he understands that while he doesn't like it, it is still the language of the unheard, and that they are doing it anyway. And this is also part of the problem with, I don't want to say completely idolizing MLK or Gandhi or any other people who peacefully protest, because they are people we should admire and people who most certainly should receive the credit they receive. However, people tend to forget, as we saw in the beginning of this video, even MLK felt to some degree that his peaceful protests were a failure even after the Civil Rights Act was passed. And in the case of Gandhi, even though he did successfully peacefully protest for the eventual independence of India, that was quickly followed by the partition, where India was split up into India, Pakistan, and eventually Bangladesh, that resulted in the deaths of between 200,000 to 200 million Indian citizens, and the displacement of 12 to 20 million people, something that Gandhi himself felt was a failure. Or at least he was regretful that, he regretted happened. And then I also want to point out that when we say, political violence is never the answer, etc., etc., violence, in the face of oppression is never the answer, I want to point out that, I want to ask, would you say that to enslaved African Americans who led uprisings such as the German Coast Uprising in 1811 in Louisiana, the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina in 1739, or Nat Turner's Rebellion in 1831, all of which failed, and all of which resulted in most of the initiators of these rebellions being massacred? Would you tell these individuals that it was pointless for them to have done this anyway? And I understand why people say that, because oftentimes it does lead to failure, but for example, in the eyes of enslaved African Americans, death, or at least the potential of death, was a better option than continued submission and servitude and, facing continued brutality at the hands of oppressors. To quote African-American historian and philosopher and poet Clint Smith, the author of this book you see here, How the Word Is Passed, A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America, to quote Clint Smith, the point of the, exploring the history of these slave rebellions, of these rebellions of enslaved African Americans against the institution of African chattel slavery, is not that they failed. It's that they happened at all. It's that things were bad enough to lead them to decide that it was better to potentially face death than to continue being subjected to oppression. Similarly, Frantz Fanon, the author of The Wretched Earth, who was an Afro-French individual who grew up in colonial French Martinique and fought in the Algerian Revolution against France, to quote him, in a colonial society that is built upon violence, the only way to overthrow it is with violence itself. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that we should do political violence, or that political violence is the only correct way, any more than I'm saying that peaceful protest is the only way. I'm just pointing out that to say that peaceful protest is the only successful way and violence always fails is incorrect. And with that, I will include all of my sources in the comments, and you all have a good day.